The internet is in chaos after a wave of shocking claims started circulating online involving Nipsey Hussle's name, Lauren London, and long-standing conspiracy theories that refuse to die down. What began as random social media speculation has now exploded into a full-blown digital storm, fueled by old interviews, resurfaced clips, and emotionally charged accusations that are spreading faster than anyone can verify. At the center of it all is Lauren London, who is now being pulled into a disturbing narrative that connects her to behind-the-scenes industry drama, alleged secrets, and unanswered questions surrounding Nipsey Hussle's tragic passing. Supporters are calling it a dangerous distortion of reality, while online commentators insist there are details that don't add up and connections people are ignoring. But things take an even more intense turn when claims begin linking people from Nipsey's closest circle, suggesting hidden tensions, unexplained interactions, and industry relationships that may have been far more complicated than the public ever realized. And now, with Nipsey's daughter being dragged into the conversation through resurfaced legal and family discussions, the situation has reached a new level of controversy, one that has divided the internet completely. What's actually true, and what's just viral speculation? Let's break it down. Before the latest wave of online claims took over social media, the story surrounding Nipsey Hussle, Lauren London, and those connected to his inner circle was already one of the most sensitive and heavily discussed topics in modern hip-hop culture. Over time, it has shifted from a tragic real-life event into a space where public memory, emotional attachment, and online speculation often collide, sometimes without clear boundaries between fact and rumor. Nipsey Hussle was widely respected not only as a rapper, but also as an entrepreneur and community-focused figure. His work in business, music ownership, and local investment made him stand out in an industry often criticized for exploitation and short-term gain. This is one of the reasons his passing had such a deep impact on fans and the wider culture. It wasn't just the loss of an artist, it was the loss of a symbol of independence and long-term vision. Lauren London, an actress and public figure, shared a long-term relationship with Nipsey and became closely associated with him in the public eye. Their relationship was often portrayed as grounded and private compared to typical celebrity couples, which contributed to the strong emotional response following his death. After the tragedy, Lauren largely stepped back from public discussion of private matters, choosing to focus on family and personal healing rather than engaging with public commentary. However, in the years that followed, social media began reshaping parts of this narrative in ways that extended far beyond verified information. Old interviews, brief clips, and unrelated statements were repeatedly resurfaced and reinterpreted through new angles. As online platforms evolved, so did the speed at which theories could spread, often faster than context or clarification could keep up. This environment created space for speculation to grow. Conversations that were once limited to fan forums or niche discussions began appearing across mainstream platforms, where short-form content and attention-driven algorithms tend to amplify emotionally charged narratives. In such spaces, incomplete information can quickly be treated as hidden truth, especially when it involves well-known public figures. At the same time, Nipsey Hussle's legacy remained a central point of discussion. His business ventures, collaborations, and industry relationships have been analyzed repeatedly by fans and commentators. Because he worked with multiple artists, producers, and executives across different stages of his career, there is a large network of connections that people continue to revisit when trying to understand his professional journey. This is where public discussion often becomes blurred. In entertainment culture, especially online, professional relationships are sometimes reinterpreted as personal conflicts, and routine industry interactions can be reframed as signs of deeper meaning. Over time, this creates an environment where assumptions begin to fill the gaps left by missing or private information. Another factor that contributed to ongoing speculation is the way high-profile tragedies are remembered in digital spaces. Instead of fading with time, they often resurface in cycles, especially when new interviews, legal discussions, or unrelated celebrity controversies bring old names back into trending conversations. Each time this happens, previous theories are also revived, often without verification or updated context. Lauren London's name, due to her personal connection with Nipsey, frequently reappears in these cycles. Most of the time, the discussions are rooted in sympathy, remembrance, or respectful reflection. However, in more extreme corners of the internet, her name has also been pulled into broader conspiracy narratives that extend far beyond confirmed events or credible reporting. It is within this already sensitive and emotionally charged environment that the latest wave of claims began circulating. Short clips, reposted interviews, and fragmented discussions started being interpreted in new ways, with users attempting to connect unrelated points into a single storyline. As with many viral controversies, the absence of clear answers often encourages audiences to search for patterns, even where none may exist. This pattern is not unique to this situation. Modern digital culture frequently transforms incomplete narratives into ongoing debates, especially when they involve well-known figures and unresolved emotional events. Once a topic reaches that stage, it becomes less about the original incident and more about how audiences interpret fragmented information over time. As the conversation continues to evolve, the line between documented history, public memory, and online interpretation becomes increasingly difficult to separate. And that is exactly why the current discussion has regained attention, because it sits at the intersection of all three. With that context in mind, the recent surge in claims involving Nipsey Hussle's daughter and Lauren London has reopened older conversations while adding new layers of controversy, pushing the narrative back into the spotlight once again. As the renewed wave of online discussions spread across platforms, the conversation quickly shifted from general reflection into something far more intense and fragmented. What began as resurfaced clips and recycled commentary soon evolved into a fast-moving cycle of claims, interpretations, and counterclaims, each one adding pressure to an already sensitive narrative. The major conflict emerged when a series of short-form videos began circulating, each presenting slightly different versions of the same idea: that there were hidden details surrounding Nipsey Hussle's final years and the people connected to him. These videos did not introduce confirmed evidence, but they were designed in a way that strongly suggested deeper meaning behind familiar public moments. Through selective editing and dramatic narration, they encouraged viewers to question what they thought they already knew. At the center of the discussion was Lauren London, whose name reappeared in connection with older interviews, social media clips, and unrelated industry interactions. While none of the resurfaced material provided direct proof of any wrongdoing, the way it was being presented online created a growing sense of suspicion among certain audiences. This is where the first major conflict took shape, not in verified facts, but in competing interpretations of incomplete information. Supporters of Lauren London immediately pushed back, arguing that the content being shared was being taken out of context and stitched together in a misleading way. They pointed out that many of the clips being used were years old, unrelated to one another, and being framed in ways that distorted their original meaning. From their perspective, the situation was a clear example of how online narratives can be constructed through selective editing rather than factual reporting. On the other side, critics and conspiracy-focused commentators argued that the sheer number of resurfaced connections could not be ignored. They claimed that while each individual piece of content might not be significant on its own, the pattern they formed suggested something worth further scrutiny. This perspective gained traction in spaces where audiences are already accustomed to interpreting celebrity stories through a lens of hidden relationships and behind-the-scenes influence. As both sides grew more vocal, the narrative reached a turning point when a previously overlooked interview clip resurfaced and began circulating widely. In the clip, a discussion about grief, emotional preparation, and personal reflection was interpreted by some viewers as evidence of foreknowledge regarding future events. However, others strongly disagreed, stating that the clip was being misrepresented and that its original context was a general discussion about spirituality and coping with loss. This disagreement marked the beginning of the first major twist in the online narrative. What had initially been a simple resurfacing of old content suddenly transformed into a polarized debate about intent versus interpretation. The same footage was being used to support completely opposite conclusions depending on who was sharing it. As the debate intensified, social media algorithms began amplifying the most emotionally charged versions of the story. Short clips with dramatic captions spread faster than longer explanations, and as a result, nuance began to disappear from the conversation. Many users who encountered the topic for the first time were exposed only to fragmented interpretations rather than full context, which further deepened confusion. At the same time, commentary channels and influencer accounts began producing breakdown-style content that analyzed the situation frame by frame. These videos often mixed verified information with speculation, presenting both as part of a single narrative. While some creators attempted to maintain balance, the competitive nature of online engagement encouraged more dramatic framing, which in turn intensified public reaction. The first real escalation occurred when discussions about Nipsey Hussle's business relationships and industry connections were pulled into the same narrative thread. His collaborations, mentorships, and professional interactions were reinterpreted by some online users as evidence of deeper industry dynamics. In reality, many of these relationships were standard within the music business, but in the context of a growing conspiracy narrative, they were reframed as potential indicators of hidden conflict. This blending of unrelated elements created a complex web of interpretation where nearly any detail could be connected to the larger theory being discussed. Once that structure formed, it became increasingly difficult for audiences to separate verified facts from speculative assumptions. The situation escalated further when discussions about Nipsey's estate and family matters began circulating alongside the same narrative threads. Legal processes involving inheritance and guardianship, normally private and procedural in nature, were pulled into public debate. Some online users attempted to connect these legal developments to broader claims, while others strongly warned against misinterpretation of sensitive family matters. This was the point where the conflict stopped being just about online commentary and became a full-scale narrative dispute. Different communities were now interpreting the same events through entirely different frameworks, one grounded in documented reality, and another shaped by suspicion, pattern recognition, and emotional inference. The first major twist solidified when it became clear that no single version of the story was being universally accepted. Instead, multiple parallel narratives were forming simultaneously. In one version, everything being shared was explained as coincidence and misrepresentation. In another, it was seen as a series of overlooked connections that deserved attention. And in yet another, it was framed as a deliberately constructed storyline amplified by online engagement cycles. Each version relied on the same set of publicly available fragments, but the meaning assigned to those fragments differed dramatically depending on perspective. As the online environment continued to react, the intensity of discussion increased, but clarity did not. Instead, the situation became more layered, with each new post or video adding emotional weight rather than factual resolution. The original context of the discussion became harder to identify, replaced by interpretations that evolved in real time. By the end of this phase, the first major twist was no longer a single moment. It had become a shift in perception. The story was no longer anchored in one event or claim. Instead, it had transformed into a network of competing narratives, each claiming to explain the same set of resurfaced materials in a different way. And once that shift occurred, the foundation was set for even deeper escalation, where interpretation itself would become the main battleground, and certainty would continue to fade with every new wave of online attention. As the debate surrounding the resurfaced clips and interpretations continued to intensify, the situation moved into a new phase where speculation no longer stayed confined to isolated posts or commentary videos. Instead, it began to spread across multiple platforms at once, with each new wave of content adding fresh layers of confusion and emotional reaction. What had started as fragmented discussion was now evolving into a fully active digital controversy, shaped by constant reinterpretation and rapid amplification. The escalation began when several high-engagement accounts started compiling older interviews, public appearances, and unrelated industry discussions into single narrative threads. These compilations were presented as timelines, suggesting connections between events that were originally unrelated. While none of the material introduced new verified information, the way it was organized gave the impression of a structured storyline, which significantly increased its impact on viewers. This shift in presentation played a key role in accelerating public interest. Instead of individual clips being viewed separately, audiences were now being guided through curated sequences designed to imply meaning through arrangement rather than explicit evidence. As a result, many viewers began engaging with the content as if they were uncovering a hidden pattern, even though the underlying material remained unchanged. As these threads gained traction, reactions became more divided and more intense. Supporters of the individuals involved argued that the narrative was being artificially constructed through selective editing and emotional framing. They emphasized that when taken in full context, the resurfaced material did not support the conclusions being drawn online. However, critics and speculative commentators maintained that the growing number of coincidences being highlighted could not be dismissed so easily. This disagreement marked the beginning of a deeper escalation, where interpretation itself became the central point of conflict. Instead of debating specific facts, users began debating how facts should be understood. The conversation shifted from what happened to what it means, which naturally allowed for a wider range of conclusions and theories to emerge. At the same time, algorithm-driven platforms began amplifying the most emotionally charged versions of the discussion. Short-form videos with dramatic titles and selective excerpts received significantly higher engagement than balanced explanations. This imbalance encouraged creators to focus on content that provoked strong reactions, further intensifying the overall narrative environment. As a result, the controversy expanded rapidly beyond its original audience and reached users who had no prior context. The escalation reached a critical point when discussions about industry relationships and personal connections were merged into the same narrative space as the resurfaced clips. This blending of topics created the impression of a single interconnected storyline, even though the original sources were unrelated. Once this perception took hold, it became increasingly difficult for audiences to separate distinct events from interpreted connections. Within this environment, even routine public information began to be re-examined through a speculative lens. Old interviews were analyzed for hidden meaning, casual remarks were interpreted as coded references, and unrelated professional interactions were reclassified as potential evidence of deeper involvement. This interpretive expansion significantly widened the scope of the controversy, pulling more names and events into the discussion. The most dramatic escalation occurred when a widely shared post claimed to have identified inconsistencies in the timeline of certain public appearances. The post suggested that overlapping schedules and revisited interviews could indicate a more complex sequence of events than previously understood. Although the claims were not independently verified, they spread quickly due to their structured presentation and confident tone. As this claim circulated, commentary channels reacted almost immediately. Some creators attempted to debunk the interpretation by breaking down the timeline in detail, while others used it as a foundation to build even more elaborate theories. This back and forth created a feedback loop in which each response generated further discussion, ensuring that the topic remained continuously active across platforms. The escalation was further intensified by the emotional nature of the subject matter. Because the discussion was tied to real individuals and a widely recognized legacy, many users approached the content with strong pre-existing feelings. This emotional engagement contributed to more polarized reactions, as audiences were more likely to align with interpretations that matched their initial perspective. The shocking reveal moment arrived when a newly surfaced compilation video began circulating, claiming to organize previously shared material into a single coherent narrative sequence. The video did not introduce new footage, but it presented existing clips in a highly structured format that suggested a chronological progression of events. This editing approach created the impression of revelation, even though the content itself was composed entirely of previously available material. What made this moment significant was not the content itself, but the reaction it generated. Many viewers interpreted the compilation as confirmation that the fragmented pieces of the story could be arranged into a meaningful whole. Others strongly disagreed, arguing that the sequence was artificially constructed and designed to manipulate perception through editing rather than evidence. Despite the disagreement, the compilation rapidly spread across platforms, becoming one of the most widely discussed pieces of content in the ongoing controversy. Its impact was amplified by the fact that it appeared to explain earlier confusion, even if that explanation was not universally accepted. In the aftermath of its release, the discussion reached a new level of intensity. Users began revisiting earlier clips with renewed focus, attempting to identify additional connections or inconsistencies. At the same time, Critics warned that the increasing reliance on reinterpretation was moving the conversation further away from verifiable information and deeper into speculative reconstruction. This moment marked the peak of escalation in the narrative cycle. The story was no longer driven by individual claims or isolated clips, but by the continuous reorganization of existing material into new interpretive frameworks. Each new layer of analysis added complexity without resolving uncertainty, ensuring that the controversy remained active and unresolved. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the situation had moved beyond simple online discussion. It had become a self-sustaining narrative system where content, interpretation, and reaction continuously fed into each other, making closure increasingly difficult to achieve. As the escalation phase continued to circulate across social platforms, the public reaction to the ongoing narrative became increasingly fragmented. What once began as curiosity-driven discussion had now split into multiple competing interpretations, each shaped by different levels of context, emotional investment, and exposure to varying forms of content. The result was not a single unified response, but a collection of overlapping reactions that often contradicted one another. Among general audiences, the most noticeable shift was from engagement to uncertainty. Early reactions were driven by intrigue. Users were actively watching clips, reading threads, and attempting to piece together a coherent understanding of the situation. However, as more compilations and reinterpretations emerged, a growing number of people began expressing confusion rather than conviction. Many comments reflected a sense of overload, with users openly stating that the volume of conflicting information made it difficult to determine what, if anything, was reliable. At the same time, another segment of the audience became increasingly investigative in tone. These users treated the situation less like entertainment and more like a puzzle to be solved. They created detailed breakdowns, comparison threads, and annotated timelines, attempting to organize scattered content into structured narratives. While these efforts were often presented as neutral analysis, they were still influenced by interpretation, meaning that different creators produced entirely different conclusions using the same source material. This dual response, confusion on one side and investigative enthusiasm on the other, created a divided audience landscape. One group disengaged due to uncertainty, while another became more deeply involved in analysis, further amplifying the visibility of the topic across platforms. Influencers and commentary channels played a significant role in shaping how the public interpreted the situation. Many creators released rapid response breakdowns as soon as new compilations or posts surfaced. These videos typically combined existing clips with added narration, framing the material in ways that encouraged viewers to view the situation through a specific lens. Because different creators adopted different perspectives, audiences were exposed to multiple competing narratives in a short period of time. This led to a noticeable inconsistency in public understanding. Depending on which content a viewer encountered first, their interpretation of the situation could differ significantly. Some videos emphasized the idea of misinterpretation and media manipulation, while others highlighted perceived patterns and unresolved questions. As a result, the commentary ecosystem did not consolidate understanding, it expanded divergence. Traditional media outlets approached the situation with more caution. Rather than engaging with speculative claims directly, most coverage focused on the broader phenomenon of how digital narratives evolve. Articles and segments examined how fragmented content spreads, how reinterpretation influences perception, and how rapidly online discussions can shift without new factual developments. This more measured approach stood in contrast to the fast-moving nature of social media discourse, where speed often took priority over verification. Within industry circles, reactions were more restrained but analytically focused. Professionals familiar with media production and content distribution emphasized that the majority of materials being circulated were being interpreted outside their original context. They pointed out that editing structures, compilation formats, and promotional clips are often designed for flexibility and audience targeting, not as standalone narratives. When removed from their intended framework, such content can easily be reinterpreted in unintended ways. This perspective highlighted a growing disconnect between production reality and public perception. While industry professionals viewed the situation through the lens of workflow, context, and distribution practices, online audiences were primarily engaging with emotional interpretation and narrative construction. This mismatch contributed to ongoing misunderstanding, as technical explanations did not always address the emotional conclusions drawn by viewers. Entertainment industry observers also noted the reputational sensitivity surrounding the discussion. Because the narrative involved real individuals and a widely recognized legacy, there was a general reluctance among public figures to comment directly. Instead, most responses were indirect or avoided entirely. This silence, however, was itself interpreted by online audiences in multiple ways, with some viewing it as caution and others interpreting it as avoidance. As the conversation continued, discussions also began to expand beyond the individuals directly involved. Broader questions emerged about how digital platforms shape narrative perception, how algorithms influence visibility, and how audiences process incomplete information. In this sense, the situation became less about the original content and more about the mechanics of modern attention itself. Despite this broader reflection, emotional engagement remained strong. Fans continued to defend the integrity of those involved, emphasizing respect, legacy, and the importance of avoiding conclusions based on fragmented information. Critics, meanwhile, continued to question inconsistencies and highlight perceived gaps in the narrative. Neutral observers often found themselves oscillating between both positions as new content emerged. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the public and industry response had not moved toward resolution. Instead, it had expanded the range of interpretations while reducing the likelihood of consensus. The conversation had become self-sustaining, shaped by continuous cycles of content creation, analysis, and reaction. Rather than converging on a single understanding, the narrative had fractured into multiple parallel viewpoints, each supported by its own set of interpretations, and each equally active within its own audience space. Just when the online discussion appeared to be settling into repetition, a new development emerged that shifted the entire direction of the narrative once again. Unlike previous waves of reinterpretation and compilation videos, this moment introduced something that appeared to carry a higher level of structure, enough to make even long-time observers pause before reacting. It began with a quietly circulated archive entry that surfaced on a lesser-known documentation platform. At first glance, it looked like a routine metadata update connected to previously discussed clips. However, users quickly noticed a newly appended classification tag attached to the earliest known version of the resurfaced material. The tag read, "Context-separated release node." The phrasing immediately triggered debate. Some users argued that it was simply technical terminology used in media storage systems, referring to how content is organized for distribution. Others suggested that the wording implied a more deliberate separation between original recording and public presentation, hinting that the material had passed through additional layers before being made available. What made this development more significant was not the term itself, but the additional notes attached to it. The archive entry referenced a multi-stage interpretation chain, suggesting that the content had been processed through several contextual layers before reaching its final form. While no direct explanation was provided, the language implied a structured pathway between creation and public release that had not been previously discussed in earlier narratives. Within hours, screenshots of the archive entry spread widely across social platforms. Commentary accounts began dissecting each phrase, attempting to determine whether it represented standard archival terminology or something more unusual. As expected, interpretations quickly diverged. Some framed it as routine technical documentation being misread through a speculative lens, while others viewed it as indirect confirmation that the content had been deliberately framed at multiple stages. The second development arrived shortly after, further intensifying the situation. A short, unlisted media fragment began circulating through private links and reposts. The clip itself was brief and visually unremarkable, but what drew attention was the embedded overlay text that appeared near the end. It read, "Final context node not included in public sequence." Unlike previous ambiguous phrases, this one appeared more definitive in tone. It did not suggest interpretation, it suggested absence. And that absence immediately became the focal point of discussion. Users began questioning what a final context node could represent. Some speculated it referred to an editorial layer meant to provide framing or explanation for the content. Others suggested it could be a technical placeholder unrelated to narrative meaning. However, because no official clarification was available, the phrase quickly became a symbolic anchor for speculation. As the clip continued to circulate, attention shifted to the implications rather than the content itself. The idea that a final contextual layer might exist, but was not included in the public sequence, introduced a new dimension to the ongoing debate. It suggested that viewers may have been engaging with an incomplete interpretive structure all along, without knowing what was omitted. This moment created immediate polarization. One group argued that the new information reinforced earlier concerns about selective presentation and fragmented framing. Another group insisted that the language was being overinterpreted and likely reflected internal system labeling rather than narrative intent. Despite the disagreement, both sides acknowledged that the terminology had introduced a new level of uncertainty. Shortly after the clip disappeared from circulation, an official-looking statement was released by a representative account associated with archival documentation. The statement confirmed that unauthorized access to restricted metadata layers had occurred, but it did not verify the authenticity or meaning of the circulated phrases. It also stated that a review process was underway, with no further details provided. This non-confirmation did little to reduce speculation. If anything, it intensified it. The lack of explanation allowed audiences to interpret the silence in multiple directions, reinforcing existing divides in perception. As the discussion continued, attention shifted from the content itself to what might still be missing. The phrase "final context node" became a recurring reference point in threads, videos, and discussions, often used as shorthand for the idea that the story remained incomplete at a structural level. By this stage, the narrative had reached a point where resolution no longer felt imminent. Each new development did not resolve previous questions, but instead introduced additional layers of interpretation. The absence of clarity itself had become part of the story, and so the situation closed not with an answer, but with a deeper uncertainty, one that reframed everything that had come before it. Because if a final context truly existed but was never shown, then the question was no longer just about what happened, it was about what was never allowed to be seen. At this point, the narrative surrounding Nipsey Hussle, Lauren London, and the resurfaced online discussions has moved far beyond simple clips, interviews, or isolated claims. What remains is not a single clear storyline, but a layered mix of interpretations, emotional reactions, and fragmented content that continues to circulate without full resolution. And that is exactly why this conversation still matters. Because whether someone sees this situation as misunderstood context, selective editing, or something deeper entirely, one fact is undeniable. Modern online narratives are no longer shaped by one source of truth. They are built through repetition, reinterpretation, and the way audiences engage with incomplete information. Before accepting any version of this story as final, it is important to step back and look at how it formed in the first place. Which parts are based on verified public information? Which parts come from commentary, edits, or secondhand interpretation? And which parts exist only because repeated circulation made them feel familiar? In an environment where clips can be rearranged, quotes can be reframed, and timelines can be reconstructed in seconds, critical thinking becomes more important than ever. Not every viral explanation is complete, and not every compelling narrative is necessarily accurate. This is why understanding context is more powerful than reacting to fragments. So as this discussion continues to evolve online, the real takeaway is not about choosing a side in a constantly shifting narrative, but about recognizing how easily perception can be shaped when information is incomplete. If anything, this case serves as a reminder of how quickly digital conversations can spiral, and how important it is to question what we see before turning it into belief. Because in the end, the loudest story is not always the most accurate one, and the most repeated version is not always the most true.